Hello and welcome to How to See Spiritually, a series with me, Mark Vernon, about intuition and the eye of the soul. If you like the talk, please do share it, make some comments and visit my website. In this episode, I'd like to talk about something a bit different, and that is the paranormal, psi. Things that are a bit different, in fact. And it comes up very naturally in any kind of discussion of spiritual life, because it seems to be the case that as people develop the ability to see spiritually, as they develop the capacity to perceive to the implicit in life, what are otherwise called abnormal, paranormal, psi events start to occur. They become more frequent. So it seems an important area to think about, partly because it's very fascinating and interesting, partly because it's some sort of indicator that spiritual sight is being developed. And then there's the question of what is it indicating? What's this all about? Now, first of all, should just sort of cover the ground where I'm starting from. I personally take it as read that the paranormal is proven enough to exist. And by paranormal, I'm talking about things like telepathy, seeing at a distance, clairvoyance, that kind of domain, presentiment, some sense of things which are about to occur. I think it's been proven actually even in the lab, which is quite remarkable because then the things that tend to nurture these incidents get sort of stripped away in the interest of scientific control and statistical anomalies. And nonetheless, they still seem to remain. And I wanted just to read a quick quote by a woman called Jessica Utz, who was the president of the American Statistical Association, so one of the big bodies that look at the way that the scientific method works. And she had been doing a lot of work in parapsychology herself, and a couple of years ago when she was the president, in her presidential address, said these things. She said, for many years I've worked with researchers doing very careful work in parapsychology. The data is supportive of precognition and possibly other related phenomena, and they're quite strongly statistical and would be widely accepted if they pertain to other data. When I've given talks on this topic to audiences of statisticians, I show lots of data. I think people are justifiably sceptical because most people think that the abilities contradict what we know about science, but in fact they don't. So she's someone who's looked at this for many years from a very sort of hard science point of view, and has come to the conclusion that the paranormal does in fact exist. These things do occur. People do have these experiences. So that sort of is the basis from which I wanted to begin. There will be skeptics that pop up and question these things. They'll continue to do that, no doubt. But I think that we can more or less take it as sorted, even if it's not in your own personal experience, which is often the thing that convinces people most when a strange coincidence occurs and they have the sense of someone calling, and then they do. Someone seems to know something in a way they couldn't possibly have known it. That, in a way, is what more directly convinces people and is indicative, I think, of something being seen at spiritual depth. Now, many spiritual adepts report that these things start to grow, start to become more and more everyday as their spiritual sense increases. In the Buddhist tradition, they're known as siddhis. In the Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, it would be more common to talk of miracles. I personally don't think these are sort of interventions from a god who would otherwise leave things just to tick over by themselves. I think they're deeply embedded in nature. They're more supernormal, you might say, than supernatural. It's just that individuals who become more in tune with that level of reality somehow facilitate it or enable it to happen. So people become faith healers. They become people around whom strange things seems to happen. There are clearly frauds too in this area, there's no doubt about that, but nonetheless that doesn't explain the whole thing. So spiritual adepts report them. They seem to occur as spiritual growth deepens. I think they're also interesting for us, perhaps on the sort of the other side of the spiritual adept's experience of life, because there's something about the more breaking in. I think that's partly why they're so interesting, that it's like the normal way we thought things were suddenly shifts or shatters a bit, and it's like something more breaks in momentarily. It's a reflexive notion, in other words, and this has been developed by various psychologists of religion. It's the idea that something happens which is sort of beyond our normal experience. We then perhaps interpret it through the kinds of experiences which are available to us, and it therefore exists somewhere in between, you might say, our normal experience and very extraordinary experiences. So a really good example of this, I think, is the phenomena of UFO sightings. This is extraordinarily common, particularly in the US, and you might ask yourself why. Is this some sort of mass delusion? Might be one response. But I think a better response is that this is something about what happens in a very material culture when the spiritual more breaks through and it gets interpreted through the imagery of the day, which is a lot to do with science, space flight, alien life, and so on. If you're into psychotherapy, I work as a psychotherapist, you might think about this in terms of archetypes. It's the idea that forces which are really beyond our complete conception get kind of narrowed and channeled to our conception by an archetypal theme. And in the modern world, why wouldn't a lot to do with space and alien life and so on provide a kind of set of archetypes through which the more, perhaps in the form of UFOs, might be seen? It's one way to try and understand this really quite common experience. More generally then, it's these kind of events are about sort of wrestling with the more, trying to build it into your everyday life. More commonly, perhaps, would be sort of a sense of coincidence, a sense of telepathy, maybe spiritual beings, be that ghosts or angels. The idea would be not to take these things literally, but to try and accept them as almost like nudges that you're on the right path. I suppose coincidence would be the way that I personally experience it most commonly. I might have been reading about something or thinking about something. I step out of my house and the first thing I see is like a billboard with the name of what I've been thinking about written across it. Or I've been talking to somebody and then I talk to someone else and there's a kind of strange coincidence. And it's almost like I'm being told or can be open to, I'm on the sort of right path here. I don't think of them as anything more than that, really. They're just kind of like nudges or little confirmations that something is being tuned into appropriately. And I certainly feel that as I have tried to develop a sense of watching the implicit in life, these less explicit, less provable facets of existence, you might say, I feel that these coincidences and that kind of thing has occurred more often. And I take them, broadly speaking, to be kind of suggestions that, things are going fine. Nothing really much more than that. Little confirmations, little affirmations. With more spectacular things that people see, I've been having some very interesting conversations recently with a woman called Lorna Byrne. Now, she sees angels. She has seen angels ever since she was a child. She's now in her sort of mid to late life. She started talking about this, writing about this. And I was intrigued because I had the sense that she was onto something. I didn't really know what, but she really didn't seem like a fraud to me. She didn't seem like she was just making it up, for sure. And she also didn't seem like she was using angels as a kind of defense against life. Sometimes when people talk about things like angels, you get the sense that they're trying to protect themselves, that they're in some sort of retreat from things which are difficult. And why wouldn't they reach for angels who will bless them and look after them and so on? But with Lorna Byrne, things are a bit different because she's had quite a tough life. Her husband died young, and she said she always knew that her husband was going to die young. She's even had a child who died. I think there can be almost no worse suffering in life to watch a child die. And yet she has seen these angels throughout that period. They've been with her alongside her, but haven't, as it were, taken the suffering away. They've kind of accompanied her through that. When she offers advice to other people, it's not purely consoling. She quite often has quite sort of sharp things to say to people, but would seem to lead them into a more expansive form of life. So I sense that she's onto something. Now, of course, you could never prove this. It's her sight, as it were. It's her subjective experience. But I did talk to her about whether what she sees, you or I might feel. We might sometimes walk into a room and sense that there's something a bit out of sorts. We might meet somebody and feel that they're talking about one thing, but something else is really preoccupying them. They might seem very smiley, but underneath you sense a sort of deep sadness. In psychotherapy, we call this the countertransference. It's the kind of unspoken that if you pay attention to your inner life, you get a kind of hint and a nudge and a suggestion about. And I said to her, do you see almost personifications of things which otherwise I would just feel as little implicit feelings, sensations, and then try and work with and develop and understand. And this made sense to her, that for some reason or other, she sees quite visibly what otherwise I might just sense as a sort of nudge. It's almost like a sort of synesthesia, I think, of inner life that she sees explicitly manifest as angels in outer life. So the things which you or I might see as inner life, she sees quite explicitly in the outer world. This interpretation of what might be happening for her made sense to me too, because in the spiritual traditions, when angels are discussed, they're often talked about in what seem quite psychological ways to us. So broadly, the idea is there's kind of hierarchies of angels, levels of angels, and different levels correspond to different kinds of human experience. There might be a kind of human experience which does feel the comfort, does feel the consolation. Angels appear to Jesus in the gospel stories and do this. There's other angels which are more channeling, more giving messages. Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, it was well attested that he had what was called a demon then at that time. It didn't mean a bad guy. Demons then just meant transmitters, entities that carried signals between mortals and immortals. Socrates was well attested to have a demon stroke angel, but at a different sort of level of human experience, a different kind of psychology. And then there's more ecstatic angels, the angels that are said to see God's face, the transcendent angels and so on. So there's this sort of sense which they correspond to human psychology, almost as if they are tangible, external sides which we otherwise just sort of feel internally. So angels are picking up on another theme which we've talked about in terms of how to see spiritually, which is that what's going on inside us isn't only going on inside us, but is in some way a mirror or an echo or a reflection of that which is going on inside the cosmos as a whole. Our inner life can actually pick up on the inner life of all things. So I wonder whether that's what Lorna Burden sees quite spontaneously, quite naturally, which she calls angels, which have been called angels in the tradition. It's worth remembering that many of the most brilliant minds in human history have felt that they've dialogued with angels. People from Socrates through Thomas Aquinas. I think there's even work done on Isaac Newton, and it's thought that his sense of gravity, which after all is a kind of implicit attraction between otherwise distant bodies, was inspired by his reading about demons and angels as well, which too, as it were, transmit forces between otherwise distant minds. So, something about psi. You've got to get it right. I sort of don't want to make too much of it, but I wanted it to be here too, because I think in a quiet way, it is about opening up to the more. It is about these nudges in coincidences. It is about these intuitions which feel like they almost come from another place. And maybe it can also be about a sense of other beings, other spiritual entities which are around and about, that we otherwise just feel as presences. And certainly all the wisdom traditions suggest that the more spiritual sight develops, the more that alignment with the implicit grows, so these phenomena just become part and parcel of everyday life, and they're not sort of particularly grasped, particularly desired. They just kind of come and go as spiritual sight develops.